Hello, everyone. My name is Matt Moynihan. I'm CEO of ForcePoint, and I'm thrilled you took time out of your day to join us here for the ForcePoint Cybersecurity Leadership Forum. We're honored yet again to have Chris Krebs, Director of CISA at the DHS. CISA stands for Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, if you're not familiar with that. But Chris, welcome. A big thank you. I think the last time we saw each other in person, it was either in a dinner in San Francisco and then 100% physical environment for the last FCLF. So thanks again for joining us.
Yeah, Matt. Hey, thanks for having me. It's a real honor to be here with you today.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you for all the great work you're doing for our nation. We very much appreciate it. When you think about what's going on right now, volatility, variability, the constant rate and pace of change that's been developing over the past several months as this COVID-19 has unfolded. It seems like keeping up with the adversary and other threats out there globally has always been a core competence of the U.S. government. Corporations, from a cyber standpoint, have been trying to do that, probably with a little less success, if you will. But what's interesting about this current situation is that if you went to a chief security officer on the commercial side of things, certainly within enterprises, and said, prepare me to be 100% remote, 100% of the employees, they probably would have come back and said, give me $10 million in a year to pull it off. Yet to their credit, seemingly overnight, they did it. What are some of the lessons learned from this crisis from your perspective? And is there anything that we could have done differently to see this coming at us versus these extreme reactions to the event? How do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, so kind of like the joke you got there with the give me a year and 10 million. What has been the primary driver of the digital transformation? Has it been the CEO, the CTO, or has it been COVID? And I think what the majority of organizations would say, it's absolutely been COVID. And I can come at this from two or three different angles. First is just my own agency, 2,500 employees. We're at 93% telework right now. And we made that shift starting on Friday the 13th, March 13th. We did a test run, make sure all the kit and everything was up to date and ready to go. And then as soon as schools, particularly in the National Capital Region, went out on that Monday the 16th, we snapped to and went to telework. And it was generally a pretty seamless event, at least in the short term. And then, second perspective is helping other departments and agencies, the 100 or 101 civilian agencies similarly went to predominantly telework. And I think what we saw were unfortunately things that we knew all along, is that VPNs have not been patched and managed particularly well throughout the ecosystem, but including in the private sector. So a lot of those things we've been banging on for over a year and a half or so now. We've seen the adversary try to exploit those. So we're catching up a little bit. And I think that there was a good foundation laid over the last several years with the IT modernization efforts led on the Hill and within the administrations. And then the smart cloud migration, those sorts of activities. So people were, they had a path, they had a plan, but the plans, I think, is as you would know from your own experience, they were not designed for instantaneous activation. There were years of capital investment and deployment. So I think again, the initial switchover went pretty well. I think where we're seeing challenges now are folks that are sent home that have a laptop but are used to having a couple different screens or special equipment in their office space, special chairs or whatever. I know myself, my setup here, I'm coming to you live from my basement, a converted garage. And if I were to take down this pop-up screen behind me, you'd find a bunch of boxes behind me. So, we're not quite where we need to be, I think, for long-term telework or remote work. And to be clear, I think we'll be in this posture for quite some time. So we need to be thinking more about what is it going to take to make sure that we can be productive. And I will highlight that we have found from an unclassified space, we have absolutely been productive. I think we've been quite surprised in how we can make this remote or telework shift longer term. Obviously, bigger implications in the classified workspace, having to institute a number of different changes there that are actually in some sense quite radical. But that's just always been a different sort of risk assessments and risk management strategies.
Remind me, I remember talking to a chief security officer of a Fortune 100 company when the app stores came out and all these apps and mobile devices, and they said, my board member just told me to get on these tablets and iPhones, and I'm going as fast as I can, but I hope I don't make too many mistakes, right? But
Yeah.
they're slowing down. They said I'm only going to know that 10 years from now how many mistakes I made with this new infrastructure. COVID, as you said, certainly accelerated the move for the cloud and SaaS. Was there, as you had to shift, right? I mean, your employees' life and limbs are on the line, like everybody else's. Was there a security threshold that you felt like you had to meet before you went, that you were comfortable that you had crossed, or was it was your agency very similar to any large enterprise experience?
I think we're absolutely similar to most of the other major enterprises. We do have a range of different programs, certification processes that are in place, including FedRAMP, particularly for some of the cloud uh, deployments. We have a trusted internet connection requirement to aggregate and kind of streamline the way agencies touch the public internet and the cloud. And we had issued some updated guidance early on in the event that really allowed you to pivot away from this. You have to go back to the agency via VPN and then back out through the agency. Uh, Adopting a workplace as a service model where you can connect directly up to AWS, Azure, Google Cloud, whatever it is. Um, that's made things, I think, a lot easier. You lose a little bit of visibility, so you have to transfer some of um, the requirement setting and the sharing of information with your partners. But what we have found is that's made things much more seamless for the connections up. The other thing I'd note is that um, the perimeter effectively that we're traditionally used to, the four walls of a build of your office space, where you've got the local area network and everybody's lashed up, gives you a certain degree of control. Now that we've distributed our employees, distributed their devices, they're on their home networks, what sort of additional risk does that introduce? So we're really working through, okay, what's the easiest way to protect the government furnished equipment, the assets, when they're distributed? How do we harden the actual host? How do we put more capability on the device itself? And then how do we protect the connection back? And it's as simple as using a MiFi or Jetpack to really protect the connections. But also, to the extent we can shift really rapidly to an endpoint detection and response capability, those are the sorts of things that we had previously had in our deployment plan under the continuous diagnostics and mitigation strategy, but much further timeline out. Now, really trying to compress that deployment schedule and harden those endpoints now that they're distributed.
Yeah, it's been fascinating. CISOs would have equated BYO, mobility with BYOD before COVID-19. Now they're clearly realizing it's people as those entities left the four walls
Right.
and are working from kitchens and homes and other locations. Was it a psychological shift? Do you think that there's just is it a perceived risk? Maybe a better way to say it. People could go to the cloud from those four walls. Even some government agencies clearly are making a push to the cloud. Was it a I don't have visibility into people in the edge that was most
Yeah.
concerning? I think the risk
I
actually
think
went.
I think that's part of it. I do think it's also part of the, keeping in mind that the cloud is really the first technology that the government has not been able to develop and deploy of its own organic capability. And so, rather than being able to walk down the hall, open up the server closet and hug the warm purring server, now you're offloading a lot of that management to a third party. And that just, there's a lot of uncomfortability with that, and there's still some unknown questions or answers rather. You talked about the mistakes you'll figure out 10 years from now. I think that's absolutely the case with some of the cloud deployments. But at the same time, I think there's some advantages and data aggregation points that we can keep working through. I mean, I think about the visibility that we have through CDM, continuous diagnostic and mitigation. How can we take and extract value and insights from a single agency and deploy that insight across a broader set of agencies? And then how do I repackage that and just make it publicly available to anyone out there that says, these are the sorts of trends we're seeing. These are the best practices and successful implementations.
So do you think, certainly, I've probably seen more chief security officers in the past month than I was able to see in the previous year because I'm not getting on a plane to go
Yeah.
see them. were there some obvious benefits or accelerations of your strategies that came from a result of this I must go remote forcing function?
I think so. The way I'm looking at it from both managing my own agency and from working with our partners, what we have found is it really opens up the talent pool. For instance, if I can have remote workers, they don't have to be in DC. If you're inherently in an unclassified environment, I don't have to worry about TSSCI clearances. So I can bring real talented folks in to work with us. They can be living in upstate New York, in the anywhere throughout the country, and it just gives me, rather than hiring 50 people in DC, I can hire 50 people across the country. I think that sort of opening up the aperture on hiring is really going to change, particularly in the cybersecurity community. I think it's an important point to make right now, but given what's going on with a number of the protests and civil unrest across the country, making sure that we make cybersecurity infosec a more inclusive, diverse community. We just have these opportunities. We have all these folks that are out of work. We have all these openings in cybersecurity we've talked about for over a decade now. We can really bring those two together and get that advantage of US centric cybersecurity defense against what are generally adversaries that are fairly homogenous. So I think we've got an advantage here and really trying to figure out how to drive towards success.
Yeah, we've certainly seen this at Force Point with the more infusion of completely different and oftentimes contrarian points of view in our research labs are really what push things forward. So that's
Yeah.
a really fascinating perspective. How do you think about the threat environment? In many respects, what we see out there is the same old stuff being packaged up in a slightly different
Yeah.
way. People are targeting new types of data in form of COVID-19 cures or what have you. In many cases, they're taking the fear of the unprecedented, fear and anxiety that exists from this, dual attack, if you will, from both the personal safety and the economic safety of the individual. Anything changing from the threat environment in your perspective that's novel? And then what else are you seeing out there?
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head with the repackaging of commodity malware and other techniques. The way we're seeing the breakdowns, and I suspect you're seeing it the same way, is nation states are up to their same old tricks, whether it's the intelligence apparatus or the cyber operators. But then we also have a really active criminal environment, and then lastly, it's the disinfo space that's really active. So on the cyber, rather on the state actor front, intelligence services are doing what they always do: try to get an understanding of what's happening in a country, what their operations are, what the kind of take the temperature of the population. But we're also seeing targeting of intellectual property, particularly related to COVID vaccine and treatment development. Chinese in particular have been pretty active there, but again, I expect every country that's looking out for their people to probably get into that game. So we have been working pretty closely with the organizations that are developing the vaccine under Project Warp Speed, and making sure that we've given them everything they need to be protected and successful. And that's fundamentally a global operation. So working with a number of our allies on that.
Yeah, it's no.
On the criminal side, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, it seems like it's even getting a little bit more complicated with some of the pharmaceutical industries that have nested supply chains, and they're multiple layers in the supply chain are working remote. It has got more complex, which I would assume makes the attack surface that much more. Uh,
It's you can go talk to the Fortune 100 companies, and they feel fairly confident about their ecosystems, their enterprise. But again, to your point on the supply chain, if you even know where they are, if they're in the U.S., if they're overseas. So again, these international partnerships with our peers are absolutely critical. The thing I'll note on the criminal side is while phishing and other scams are on, there's an uptick. The really interesting thing is kind of almost the universal theme of COVID somewhere within phishing and scams. So we've been working with a number of partners. The law enforcement community is going and taking it to the bad guys there, but also working with our partners in the security research community as well as the cyber threat intelligence space to bring information together to disrupt these operations, disrupt the campaigns, get more information out there. But again, people need to keep in mind that that they're going to keep getting served up because they're getting the clicks. Everybody's at home. Everybody's in front of their device, probably more than they usually are. I know I get my weekly health check from my device. Again, it's about disrupting, and it's about raising awareness, so folks don't turn over their creds.
Yeah, speaking of disrupting, this was certainly a global issue, and you saw almost the global economy brought to their knees, for a period of 4 to 6 weeks, where there was complete lack of visibility on how this thing was going to play out. Obviously, that uncertainty was represented in an unprecedented drop in the stock market. Of course, we're back now, but one of the things I talked to chief security officers about was, what would have happened if, during that 6 week period where your business could potentially have been exposed as a not a going concern in the future based on the implications, and you got attacked by a cyber attack, or critical data was stolen. Let's just say
Yeah.
you were Equifax, and that happened during the, it certainly would have been a double whammy of unprecedented impact for a company to weather. In this particular case, while COVID-19 certainly was a tragic event globally, the essential services of our citizens were largely
Yeah.
delivered without a blip. How do you think about a cyber attack, paired with sort of a COVID-19 pandemic type of thing? Is the
Yeah.
risk gone up from that multiplication factor, if you will?
So I think the consequences have certainly shifted across a number of sectors or functions. You think about a year ago of what was truly those critical services and functions that underpin the economy. It looks differently now. Those companies that are developing therapeutics or a vaccine, they're at the very peak of that risk pyramid. So if one of them fails, then we have a national security, economic variable within the risk calculation absolutely changed. What we're looking at, and what we did in early March, was work with our partners in the federal government and in industry to say, what are those critical services and functions that really have to continue. So we issued some guidance, the essential critical infrastructure workers list. We're on version, I want to say 3 right now, 3.1. And it just says, hey, these are the things that need to continue to go on. These sorts of workers need to access their job sites, data centers, healthcare, certain aspects of the financial services, cybersecurity, incident response. Uh, and that was issued as guidance to state officials, and about 35 states took it up and implemented. So we were pretty happy about that. But then talking to organizations about how they need to exist or operate, and CSOs and CISOs in the space, we had a group of three activities: a strategic, technical, and tactical. On the strategic side, every successful organization right now, talking about that digital transformation, needs to have a telework coordinator. Okay, your security apparatus needs to be plugged in with the telework coordinator, so what's going out the door, where it is, and how it's being operated. And leadership needs to be involved. On the technical side, you got to know what assets are out there. You need to know how people are plugging into the system, implementing multi-factor to eliminate as much of that account turnover risk as possible. And then the last piece on the tactical side is know your plan. How are you going to respond today if you have an event? Do you have an incident response team on standby ready to go? Do you know who to call in the government if you need to? Have that plan. And then lastly, communications. What's your communication strategy of how you're going to talk to your workforce, talk to the public? Yesterday was a pretty interesting day with some of the wireless carrier outages. That'd be Monday. And being able to communicate quickly on that was critical, because other words, what did we get? Worst cyber attack in history against the U.S. So debunking some of those aspects was really important to communicate. Otherwise, you're going to get a lot of that misinformation out there.
That's a great point. How do you talk about understanding asset in the home environment? One thing we've seen in our business is a dramatic increase in interest in our insider threat capabilities. Right? When you think about, should we be thinking about insider threat differently now with your workforces outside of the four walls? As devices can get compromised. Soft tokens. How do you think about the insider understanding who is at the device and in target, so to speak?
Yeah, I think this is one of those areas that needs to have a little bit more examination. If you are sending folks home and they're running on their home networks, and you've got, it's it's really unclear what the health of those networks. So the average employee is likely not in a position to really ensure the top flight security of their home devices. They don't know what their kids are bringing home, or if their neighbors, for instance, in the condo complex, are riding on their Wi-Fi. So again, I think that's one of those things where you can either deploy tools out to the employee and audit their systems, or again, you can drop them on a MiFi, make sure that they've got a dedicated communications path for doing work related activity. I do think it bears some conversation longer term about this blend of SKUs of consumer grade SKUs and commercial grade SKUs, and our company's going to maintain these different product lines when the actual work environment and the home environment has started to mix together. It's hard to, I think, keep in your brain separated. Okay, this one I'm okay to go click with abandon on. The other one, it's not as safe.
Right, right. Have you seen one of the things you've been a staunch proponent of is cooperation, both in the public-private, but also intra-agency and interagency. Have you seen this, pandemic spur an increase in cooperation across the agencies, or a different sense of urgency, or do you feel it's always been there and it's business as usual?
Well, so I think what I've seen that really made me hopeful was the
That
ad
hope.
hoc trust. Yeah. Well, the ad hoc trust groups that spun up to protect the response, the Cyber Threat Intelligence League, the Cyber Threat Coalition. You had groups come together, share information to protect healthcare facilities, to take down malicious malware serving up URLs. That sort of activity is something we've been talking about operationalizing info sharing for years now, but in a really vague general environment, it's hard to do with defined objectives. But now with COVID, we've got a very clear target. So I'm trying to figure out, okay, how do we put our arms around this approach and then apply it to other things that are also critical? Defending democracy, for instance, 2020 elections. How do we keep this momentum going and bringing it forward? On the interagency front, the work I think we did together protecting the 2018 election, working with NSA, FBI, the Director of National Intelligence, Cybercom, all those folks came together then. We had a good playbook. So now with COVID, we have the ability to pull on those same relationships and mechanisms, and I think it's working pretty well.
Great. I was always curious. Did you were big proponent of election security, and it was a big focus when we spoke a couple years ago. Uh, is that the social media platforms, election security? Did you have to pick and choose? Did you get pulled in multiple directions, or were you able to sort of do everything at once with this new pandemic? How did that impact your daily allocation of time? And
Yeah, so it was actually right around the RSA conference this year where it became clear that COVID was taking off, at least here in the United States, or was very soon to be a major event. And so we had been working with our partners in the election administration space, developing guidance on how to protect in-person voting. At that point, it wasn't, I think, quite clear how significant the event was going to be. So mail-in voting was still, it was on the table. And a lot of states like Oregon and Washington have predominantly mail-in voting spaces, approaches. So, but over time, it became pretty clear that we were going to have to take a different approach. We were going to have to both protect the in-person voting as well as protect the vote by mail. We've issued guidance on both fronts. Tend to think that, assuming we get the right plans and investments in place, things should be in a pretty good, at least pretty good ramp up for 2020. But any way you cut it, this is going to be a challenging election. We're not going to have quite as many in-person voting locations. A lot of the poll workers are volunteers. They may not want to risk their health. So that's, anybody out there that wants to get involved with the election, really do encourage you to volunteer. So go approach your local election official, be part of defending democracy.
these are definitely times for sure. Will be fascinating to see. How do you think about, what are the lasting impacts from your perspective as we wrap up the conversation? I mean, maybe some on the positive and not so positive. Any guidance you'd give to, agencies and, enterprises alike?
Yeah, so a couple things. Again, I talked about getting to that endpoint detection and response capability. I think it's just part of the natural growth of an organization. Protect your network, and then get out to the device. This is really going to accelerate. I think about the sorts of things you can do across the MITRE ATT&CK framework with EDR capabilities. It's really advantageous to hardening those devices. So that's point one. Point two is continue to think through how you can use remote work capabilities, remote work in your hiring practices. Again, we have a distinct ability, a distinct advantage in diversifying our workforce, having a more inclusive environment, and that's going to give us advantages and perspectives that our adversaries don't have. I think innately the American experience can set us up for greater success in the cybersecurity game.
That's great, Chris. And we really appreciate you taking the time today to join us. And hopefully the next time I see you, it'll be in the blood and flesh. So thanks for thanks for your time.
Thanks, Matt.
Great. Thank you, everybody.